Welcome to the Point. The state capitol is typically pretty quiet during the summertime with lawmakers back in district. There isn't a lot of the normal buzz of activity in Lansing. Even so, this summer has been full of budget negotiations between smaller groups of lawmakers, leadership, and the governor's office. Those negotiations are about to come to an end because a new spending plan has to be in place in 3 weeks. This morning, the view of how that will go when legislators return to session, first from a Grand Rapids Democratic representative, Rachel Hood. Representative, let's talk a little bit about this budget process. It's an unusual one this year for a couple of reasons. Not that we haven't seen budgets go long before, because they certainly have. We had gotten used to budgets being done earlier in the previous administration, but let's admit it's easier when everybody in the legislature is the same party as the governor, so that part's not totally unexpected either. But I think the most unusual part of this budget this year is the sheer amount of money, because you expect it to be $3 billion in the red.
That's right.
And you're about $3.5 billion to the good. That's about almost a $7 billion swing.
That's
so
right.
That's some really good news, at least for this year. Where are we on the budget? What does the budget look like? What still has to be done? Because I know there's been work being done on it over the summer, but we're coming up about 3 weeks from the time that it's got to be in place.
Yeah, well, you'll recall that in June, the legislature and the administration worked together on a bipartisan budget package that made sure our schools were whole and ready to go for the school year. In addition, at that time, the House approved what I would characterize as a skinny omnibus budget. So we have approved all of the other budgets, and now we're waiting for the Senate to pick those budgets up and work through providing us with an agreement budget that we can then send to the governor. And that should be happening shortly within the next couple of weeks. We anticipate around September 23rd that we will complete the legislative budget process and pass on an agreement on a skinny budget for the fiscal year.
Let me ask you to explain right there a skinny budget, because
Yeah.
there are a couple of ways to look at this, but a skinny budget gives you kind of parameters of where you're going to spend, right?
Yeah, well, it basically is a fundamental budget that will keep government operating without disruption while we move through the work of allocating those big chunks of federal funding that have come our way as part of the American Rescue Plan.
So the process will be, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, the process will be that you will come up with a budget that the House, you've already done that, the Senate, and the governor can all agree to.
That's right.
That will keep government running. Nobody has to worry about having to close offices or anything like that.
No October 2nd panics.
Right.
Yes.
But that's not going to be all the spending, and so there will be a number of supplemental spending bills that will backfill in some of these areas. And let's talk about some of the areas that will be getting attention.
Yeah, well, roughly we have about $10 billion to spend of ARPA dollars. We also, some of those dollars are non-discretionary and some are discretionary. So in the non-discretionary space, we still have a little chunk of funding in state government terms, $381 million in schools funding for K through 12 schools that we need to allocate above and beyond the historic budget that we were able to pass in June.
That was about $17 billion in that
That's
neighborhood?
right,
And that was about $3 billion, $2.5 billion more than it had ever been spent before.
That's right, absolutely. So we're looking at, more investments in mental health. We're doing, Rep. Whiteford has a listening tour on mental health investments. The House Dems will have a listening tour in the coming weeks, and some of those funds will go to those types of investments and other supplemental pieces of the school's budget that we see, needing to be filled as we emerge out of the pandemic and continue to manage through this historic moment. We'll have $4.4 billion in non-discretionary funds, and those are really intended for some of the fundamentals. These are limited by the federal government to mental health and health care investments, responding to food crises, housing crises, providing access through the internet to those folks who need it, replacing lost revenue for our local governments, and providing premium pay to essential workers, with some of those dollars also available for some infrastructure, water, sewer, and broadband investments.
I've talked to all of my guests in the past, well, maybe for the past year, about broadband. And,
Yeah.
and this is one area that I believe, I guess it'll remain to be seen, but I believe there'll be broad bipartisan support because everybody recognizes that what some of us may not have thought about before, and that we're really deficient in broadband, not just in rural areas, which is certainly true,
Right.
but also in getting affordable broadband services in cities and elsewhere. So I guess the reason I ask the question every week is I'm kind of taking the temperature. That seems to be a pretty high priority list for many of your colleagues. Is that something you see as a priority?
It is, and the House Dems, including myself, have already introduced a package that would expand the amount of organizations and institutions, including local governments, that would be able to charge forward and build this infrastructure. It would also, give additional dollars to our traditional partners in broadband services and in fiber services, and help to address the issues that my constituents are having, not being able to afford broadband and fiber services that are extensive enough to make sure 2 kids and a parent are able to work online and do all their Zooms at the same time, as well as the issues that our rural communities experience, not being able to have access in their homes, those last mile connections and so on.
So when you get down into the fall, and I should point out, the supplemental spending can happen as you continue into September, into October, into November. I mean, the deadline will be met with the budget that you talked about, so everything will move forward. So the conversations, I assume, are going to be pretty robust about how to spend this money, because this is a chance you're never going to get it again.
It's $6 billion in in discretionary funding that we have to allocate, and that is a once in several generations investment. This is akin to building our road infrastructure in the 1950s and 60s. It needs to be focused on climate resiliency. There's a special focus on communities that have been disenfranchised in the past, and making sure that we are delivering these resources equitably, and that is a value that we share from the top down, the Biden administration, the Whitmer administration, and members of the legislature as well. And I think the governor has laid out a few ideas about where this funding can go, and we've seen some of those roll out over the summer. So she has a housing proposal that has been put in front of us, a parks proposal, small business and middle class investments, and we know we need to invest in education, DHHS, Health and Human Services. We are looking at investments for our veterans facilities here in Grand Rapids and also up north and across the state, MDOT, and the Treasury as well. So as we see these proposals, we also see proposals from the legislature, particularly around some of these infrastructure pieces. So the Democratic Senate and House members have come together with a climate resiliency proposal that looks at addressing some of the water infrastructure problems that we have across the state, but especially hard hit in those urban communities in Southeast Michigan who've been hammered this summer, storm after storm after storm. And then we also see the Senate Republicans proposing to fix our dams and respond to the crises that we hope to prevent, so that there isn't another Midland, if you will.
One of the things the governor has talked about, and I've heard, again, quite a bit of conversation about this, in addition to all of the things you've talked about, she has talked about allocating more money for training for workers. We had an event in Grand Rapids where she talked about going out and being able to get more people the certificates that they need, or the certifications as well as the skills that they need.
Right.
And that's also tied in with having adequate child care, not just adequate and affordable child care. I assume there are dollars in there for that too, I assume.
Absolutely, a significant investment in early childhood and child care to help get our workers back to work. And then we have the bipartisan agreements around our programs through the community colleges and tech programs in our universities to reconnect Michiganders to their opportunities around career advancement. We have a large population of adults who have partially finished degrees in Michigan. So we want to get folks back to get those associate degrees, to get those professional certifications, and to get those bachelor's degrees.
We're just about out of time. I know that it won't be just budget. There are other priorities I'm sure that you have out there in addition, but we don't have much time to talk about it. What else will you be working on as you move into the end of this year?
Well, I think we'll continue to see investments in lead abatement. So we've talked a lot about water infrastructure and pipes, but we have also made some significant bipartisan investments in energy efficiency in homes and lead removal in homes. Those two things go together. I anticipate that we will see these investments in parks and open spaces, shoreline investments. And I think that we have a chance, if we can come to agreement, to finally tackle those roads.
When we come back, how one Muskegon County Republican sees the budget playing out. That's next. To the point. Welcome back to the Point. Budgeting in Lansing is complicated by two factors, generally speaking: differing priorities for Republicans and Democrats, and not enough money to go around. This year, at least, the latter is not a problem. The state is awash in federal funds and has far surpassed revenue estimates here in Michigan. The big question remaining is how much and where. Norton Shores Republican Representative Greg VanWoerkom talks about that. Representative, as you and 109 colleagues prepare to head back to the legislature for full-blown session here in a couple of weeks after doing a lot of in-district work over the summertime, and I know you've been having conversations with your colleagues and committees about budget, but that will be the main focus when you all head back. What is your anticipation that process is going to look like?
I'm confident of the process right now. I sit as the chair of the General Government Subcommittee for the Appropriations, which is about a quarter or third of the budget. And we had some very productive meetings with the Senate as well as the administration. We came to a lot of conclusions and a lot of things that we agreed upon. There were some sticking points yet that we have, but we recognize we've got the fiscal year coming up here on September 30th. But we feel like we put a lot of work into it, have come to a lot of agreements, but I think we're going to be on pace to get something done. So that's very encouraging.
When you talk about the budget, you say the general fund is like a quarter to general government is a quarter to a third. That's kind of where a lot of the things are funded that we think of as governmental. I mean, because there are a couple of other big chunks, and health and human services, that kind of spending is a really big chunk. But what you're talking about funds the things that we see as government mostly.
Yeah, when you start talking about the Attorney General's office or the Secretary of State's office, which is very much a primary point of contact for most constituents in determining that budget. We also work with the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity, which is a lot of the job training programs. And a lot of the focus right now is about employment and how we're going to get people back to work. We also have jurisdiction over the Unemployment Insurance Agency, which is certainly on a lot of people's minds right now, whether they've received some of those letters or have had trouble getting their benefits. So it's a lot of those things that people feel right on the surface when they're actually dealing with their state government.
Do you have a sense, and maybe you can't say, do you have a sense what the overall budget may be in dollars and cents? Because we saw a pretty significant jump in some of these budgets over, perhaps the first year, the budget that was at least proposed had considerably more dollars attached to it. But this year, I'm assuming you'll break all records given the amount of money you have to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, you got two separate things here. I think coming in, everyone kind of thought that this would be a budget cutting year. the expectation of what state revenues were going to be compared to previous years because of the pandemic and the government shutdown, the economic shutdown that occurred. What actually ended up happening was it was about 2 months, but then everything kind of bounced back fairly quickly, that we have significant tax revenue coming in. So there's two elements here. You have the actual state dollars that are coming in, and then you have those federal dollars that the state needs to allocate yet. So at both instances, we do have dollars that we weren't anticipating necessarily at the beginning of the fiscal year. So right now, what we're talking specifically about for the September 30th deadline is those actual state revenue dollars. And once we settle that, I think then there will be the conversation about how you allocate what will be about $3 billion this fiscal year, but $6 to $8 billion overall of federal dollars that we yet need to allocate for the state.
I think it's important that you make that distinction because at once you will work on that state budget, just like you said, and we know that that deadline is coming up on the 30th. But the rest of that money does not have to necessarily be spent by that, and not necessarily through the same process, but it will be through supplemental expenditures, if I understand it correctly. Is that how that works?
Yeah, I don't want to talk too much Lansing speak with supplementals and stuff like that, but we've tried to separate the two issues of what do we do with the state dollars coming in and what do we do with some of these federal dollars. And it does get confusing, and there has been a lot of confusion put out there that some cities and villages and townships have received direct dollars from the federal government. So they are making those decisions as boards and councils of how to do that. And counties have received direct funds from the federal government, and they're determining. And then we have an allocation as well on the state side and how we determine how those dollars are going to be spent. In the past, some of those went directly to departments, either through the governor or maybe the Secretary of State. This time, a lot of those dollars need to be done in a way with the legislature and the executive, how those are going to be spent.
So I should point out that it's not the entire budget that you have to work on because the school aid fund was already done. You did that before you guys slowed down for the summer a little bit. Talk to me a little bit about that because that was the largest school aid fund that has ever been passed in the state of Michigan. Again, there were special funds in there to deal with some very specific problems related to the pandemic and some of the real stresses that schools had been under. But you as Republicans and Democrats came together and passed that. What was your take on that process?
I think that's an important thing. I mean, we talk about our fiscal years, which again is kind of an archaic term, but our fiscal year begins September 30th for the state government. But schools, usually they need to set their budget by July 1st. So we wanted to make sure that in this time and in a time of uncertainty that the schools had the ability to set their budgets. And schools have received significant dollars as well through the different federal programs. But it helps to have what that per pupil rating is going to be in that allocation. And we were very proud as House Republicans, as well from the state government side, of creating a record amount per pupil spending, plus finally creating the parity that we've been seeking since 1994 when Proposal A was set, of having that all the dollars be equal per district, rather than having some districts having a little bit more than other districts. We finally evened that out in this budget, which was the first time since 1994.
Let's talk about some of that federal money that will not necessarily be spent in this budgeting process that you'll take care of, I'm guessing, in a couple of weeks. But let's talk about one-time funds that you as a legislature will be trying to put to work, understanding that if you create a program that is started with those funds, it would be up to the state to come up with funds to backfill that going forward. So how do you spend one-time money and not create a deficit in years future?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that's something that House Republicans are focused on. I guess when I came into this, in thinking about these dollars that were going to be allocated, my rule of thumb was this is money that is being provided to states by federal government debt. The federal government doesn't have these dollars to spend. It's actually creating debt for the states to spend these dollars. So if you look at that perspective, what are those programs that actually benefit the next generation or the generation after that? Because in actuality, those are the ones that are going to be paying for this long-term liability. So how do you think of programs? How do you think of one-time programs that are going to benefit them or change systems, whether it relates to healthcare or investing in things such as infrastructure that is going to ultimately be around for several generations and benefits them as they ultimately are going to be the ones that are paying for it.
I don't think I have done a show in the past several months that we haven't talked about some of that money. And one of the places that I seem to get a lot of agreement from Democrats, Republicans, kind of across the board, is when it comes to broadband and high-speed internet services, because we saw a great discrepancy around the state in who had service and who didn't, where there was affordable service, where there wasn't, and how important that was in education. Is it your thought that some of that money may go to try to fix that part of infrastructure in the state?
I certainly have advocated for that. My district is in Muskegon County, as you know, and half of my district is very rural areas. And rural broadband has been discussed for decades. Unfortunately, I don't think we've gotten it right at the federal or state or local level of actually helping and impacting people. Here's an opportunity with the amount of dollars and what we saw when schools were shut down and how to deliver virtual education to those students. We finally saw the real impact of what the lack of broadband and high-speed internet has on these areas. And if this is a method of the future of delivering these services, we need to pay attention. We need to start putting some of that infrastructure actually in place. Going into it, there's a lot of details. I say that my district is half rural. When you think of rural, and I say that word, you think of the cornfields, or maybe in our instance, the apple fields and the asparagus fields and the blueberry fields and the picturesque barn on there. But it's also the wooded areas, which are dominated by state forests or national forests, that it gets difficult to get a signal in there. So if you're talking about wires and fiber, you also have to be talking about satellites. So it's a far more complex issue of just saying we need to expand broadband. It's how do you actually deliver that service in a cost-efficient manner to some of those sparse areas.
The real work of passing the state budget should be in full swing by the week of the 20th. We'll keep a close eye on the progress there and be back with a final thought next. To the point. There is much for the legislature to do when they return to Lansing. The budget will be job one, and we'll be following that right here every weekend when you join us. To the point.